So, welcome everyone again, and thank you for joining us today. I would like to introduce you all to Dr. Nikita Hayden, and Nikita is currently doing her postdoc in University of Warwick, and she'll be talking to us today about siblings of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So, over to you, Nikita.
Yeah, thank you everyone for turning up. Electronically at least. I'm going to share my screen and then we'll get started. Okay, so yeah, I'll be talking today about siblings of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And just to provide a little overview of what we're going to be talking about, I'll provide a bit of context, including some personal, theoretical and empirical context. I'll then spend some time talking about sibling psychological outcomes, then their sibling relationships, and then I'll talk about implications, including theoretical, practical, clinical, and research implications. So I realised we might be quite a mixed audience. So I thought we'd just start off by trying to think about why we'd be interested in siblings of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And I think it's a really fair question, even in the IDD field, because we know that people with ID, people with developmental disabilities, they're underfunded and there's not enough research and support for those groups. So why would we think about siblings? There are two main questions that kind of come up in the research that indicate why siblings might be worthy of study and support. One of them is this question about whether siblings are an at-risk group in and on themselves. So are siblings at risk of worse outcomes than other children or other adults because they have a brother or sister with an intellectual or developmental disability? And there have been some population level data examining this question from Hayden et al., Marquez et al., and Vry et al., so quite recent stuff on this. And the other question is about who will support people with intellectual and developmental disabilities when their parents are no longer able to. So siblings are often positioned as a solution to the future caregiving needs of people with IDD. And I think this is going to become increasingly important for two main reasons. The first is that people with IDD are living longer and healthier lives than ever before, which is obviously brilliant. That shows big increases in health equality, but it does mean that they're going to be outliving their parents for the first time in this generation. And then the other issue is that there are severe reductions in state welfare available in many national contexts, but especially in the United Kingdom. Sibling relationships, though, are also really important. Sibling relationships can provide a place of support, care, advocacy, as well as friendship for both siblings as well as their brother or sister with an IDD. And what we've seen in existing research is that there is an association between sibling relationship quality and siblings' willingness to take on care and support roles in the future. So to offer a little bit of context, I have some personal experience with a sibling. My brother's autistic, and so I came at this research with that kind of personal experience, and with that probably came some extra insider knowledge, but it also probably came with some assumptions about the research as well. My PhD research included studies about both child and adult siblings, and the research was funded by the ESRC as well as the UK charity SIBS. And the collaboration with SIBS has included things like an evaluation of an intervention called SIBS Talk, an adult sibling survey, which I'll talk to you a bit about today, and the adult evidence review. And I've also been able to do some engagement with participant and patient involvement, which is basically participant engagement and something that's a requirement for us to do over here in the UK. And that was with setting up the Sibling Research Advisory Group with Georgia and Mary. Some of you are probably already aware of SIBS and what they do, but for those that aren't so familiar, SIBS is the only UK charity supporting and representing the needs of siblings of disabled people. And they have both support programmes available for young siblings as well as adult siblings. So this includes an intervention for young SIBS, training professionals to run support groups, information. For adult siblings, it includes things like phone and email support, network and peer support groups and guides, workshops, conference events. So I think if any of you are siblings and you're not so familiar with SIBS work, definitely sign up to their mailing list because they've got lots of things to offer and share, I think, with siblings, as well as people that do work with siblings as well. So in terms of a theoretical context, family and sibling research in the IDD field has often been criticised for being atheoretical, and where theories and concepts have been pulled in, it's quite commonly family systems perspectives. And this theory suggests that family members are interdependent And what's useful about this theory is they also consider the sibling subsystem specifically. And more recently, what we've seen is some more multi-level embedded approaches to sibling systems, looking specifically at children and families of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So here we've got the embedded systems framework by Kovchev et al. And what we can see here is these sort of within sibling factors, such as siblings' personality, their personal interpretation of events, their micro and meso systems, which will include things like their immediate family, their extended family, their peers, their school, their workplace, things like their exosystem, which includes things like media, local politics, and supports that parents are getting. And then the macro system, which is much wider, covers things like religion, social class, political structures, cultural factors such as ideology around parenting, ideology around disability. And all these things work together, fluctuating over time, leading to sibling outcomes, which then feeds back into the system. And it's kind of meant to be picturing and capturing the fact that it's never a stable model. It's always moving, it's always dynamic. However, in saying that, there are questions about whether a family systems perspective is dynamic enough to model such a complex concept. And this question still exists, even though embedded systems models definitely do a lot of work in terms of moving it on towards a more dynamic model. So one theory that gets used a lot in the general sibling literature, where neither of the children or neither of the adults have an intellectual or developmental disability, is social learning theory. And this theory is completely premised on the idea of reciprocity, that both siblings are learning social behaviours from one another that then go on and influence their other social relationships. And it's really interesting to me that in the IDD literature, we don't really pick up on this theory. And for me, I think that might be related to the assumption that we have that it's somehow the person with IDD who's affecting negatively their sibling, and we don't really consider that reciprocal relationship very much. We also have stress theories, and more recently, these have kind of developed into resilience theories. And the double ABCX model, I think, gets used a little bit more in the IDD family literature. So they refer to the AA factor, this pile-up of stresses or demands. So that could be a child who is disabled being born or being diagnosed and needing supports, for example, moving into secondary school and needing extra support and not getting it. That can be a pile-up of stresses. The BB factor refers to the resources families can apply in response to that situation. The CC factor refers to the changes families make to their interpretation of the situation or stressor. And then the XX factor talks about the way the family adapts to the stressor. And what I find quite useful about the double ABCX model is if we have a look at this little diagram here, it allows us to see this really simple direct effect between A and X, but it also gets you thinking about indirect effects, so mediating effects here or moderating effects here. And so it helps us to start thinking about more bidirectional relationships and more indirect effects. So it helps us to think about slightly more interesting ways to model our statistical analyses. Developmental and lifespan perspectives gets used a bit as well, mostly to justify why we focus on adults, which for me is really obvious. I mean, adults are also in need of, relationships, social support, and adults also have brothers and sisters with intellectual and developmental disabilities, but they're often forgotten in a lot of the research. So often people will use this perspective to be able to justify why we focus on adults, or why we concentrate on longitudinal studies, which allow us to see how siblings' outcomes change over time. And a conceptual issue which is really quite prominent in the last decade in sibling research is this desire to disrupt negative narrative. So there is this assumption sometimes seen whereby we assume that a child or an adult will have worse mental health, worse well-being, worse health, just because they have a brother or sister with an intellectual and developmental disability. And as we'll start to see in some of the empirical research, some siblings aren't faring so well, but lots of siblings are doing well. So there's a real need, I think, to disrupt a negative narrative, to not only kind of disrupt some disableist notions about the effects disabled people have on the people around them, but also just to make sure that we don't give support to people that don't need it when we're strapped for money in terms of how we support people. I thought I'd just spend a moment talking about the empirical gap. So in the research evidence, what are we under researching at the moment? So I've mentioned that sibling research focuses a lot on psychological outcomes. These studies are really mixed, and that's likely due to methodological issues. So, for example, there's a lack of population level data. This data is often quite small scale, and there are a few comparisons made to normative samples, and that can make it really, really hard to contextualize findings. It's also the case that there are certain contexts which remain less commonly well examined. So, for example, adults are less examined, but also the sibling relationships less examined compared to psychological outcomes. And if we think about that embedded systems table by Kovchev et al., there's a question about whether certain contexts like the extended family or school-based context might also be useful to understand more as well. And as mentioned by the AABCX stress model, the analyses tend to focus on direct effects, and there's a need, I think, to look at moderated effects or reciprocal effects as well. So I'm going to talk now about the psychological outcomes of siblings of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, mostly focusing on adults, but I will mention about child siblings that there have been a couple of now population studies coming out in 2019. So the first one's one that I did with my supervisors, and we used the Millennium Cohort study, and we found that older siblings of children with intellectual disability had 1.5 to 2 times more emotional and behavioural problems. And then once we started controlling for other covariates, they explained the differences in sibling outcomes much better. So, for example, socioeconomic factors were explaining siblings' worse outcomes more because, for example, families of children with intellectual and developmental disabilities are more likely to be in poverty and then experience poverty later as well. So if we're thinking about, well, how are we going to support child siblings, we could be thinking about focusing particularly on children who are also experiencing some socioeconomic deprivation. Some work came out a little bit later in 2019 by Marcus et al, and they used Canadian population level data to examine the psychological outcomes of siblings of children with developmental disabilities. So that included intellectual disability, but it also included things like autism. And they used Ministry of Health data in British Columbia, and they found that siblings had an increased odds of depression and other mental health problems compared to other children. And they found that even when they controlled for some financial aspects. So that was an interesting difference. However, what I would say is that because it was health data, they didn't have as many covariates to control for. So they weren't able to look at multiple dimensions of poverty or socioeconomic status. Plus, Canada probably has a slightly more developed welfare state at the moment compared to the UK. So that might also explain some of the differences we're seeing there. So I'm now going to focus on adults' outcomes using data from the Adult Sibling Survey. So adult siblings are seen as a source of care, support, advocacy and friendship for their brothers and sisters with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And in population level data, there's only one study that we've been able to find so far that looked at any young adult siblings outcomes, and that was Rye et al. And they found that young adult siblings in a Swedish cohort study had higher odds of depression. And it wasn't a main focus of their paper at all. They were interested more in autism and the outcomes of autistic people, and they were testing basically the biological associations, and to do that they looked at full siblings and half siblings. So it was pure accident that we've got data on this, but this is the only population data we have on adult siblings. What we see as well is a lack of large-scale data about adult siblings with a lack of comparison to normative populations, so it makes it hard to contextualize the outcomes in comparison to other adults. So the Adult Sibling Survey, this ran, I think, back in 2019, I want to say, and it was in collaboration with the UK charity SIBS, and they pushed the recruitment really, really hard and managed to get for us 911 adult siblings to take part, which makes it the largest UK sample of adult siblings. The mean age was 34, so quite a young sample. They were predominantly female, and only 11% of the sample were living in the 20% most deprived neighbourhoods. So what this means is we have a big enough sample of people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds to do some interesting analyses with that, but it does mean that our sample isn't representative of the UK generally. And our research questions for this were, does the socioeconomic status and the level of independence of a brother or sister with intellectual disability moderate the association between sibling care status and siblings' mental distress, well-being, quality of life and health outcomes. And then we had a couple of subsidiary questions. So one of them was about how sibling outcomes compare to other adults. And the other subsidiary question was about how siblings who are carers, how their outcomes compare to siblings who are not carers. So here's a comparison between sibling outcomes compared with the outcomes of other adults who are not siblings, or people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And what we can see is that siblings had worse scores across the 4 outcomes, across mental distress, well-being, quality of life and health, and that was statistically significantly so. If we jump over there and we have a look at the effect sizes. So is that a question or?
No, I think someone unmuted. So.
Okay. So if we look here at the effect sizes here, what we can see is the mental distress effect size is large, the well-being effect size is medium, but the quality of life and the health effect sizes are quite small. And so what I would say is that because we know we've got a biased sample, I wouldn't pay too much attention to this statistically significant difference here. But the well-being and mental distress ones I would pay more attention to because the effect sizes hold up. And then we looked at group comparisons between siblings who were a carer and siblings who were not a carer. And what we found here was that siblings who were carers, again, had worse outcomes across all the measures compared to siblings that weren't carers. And this was statistically significantly so. However, again, if we look at these Cohen's D's, these effect sizes, all the effect sizes are small. So that difference is likely not to be as great as we might have assumed it was going to be. Then we did moderated multiple regression models. We wanted to see how this association between carer status and sibling outcome was associated with the moderated effects of subjective poverty amongst siblings and the independence level of the person with intellectual and developmental disability. And we also included a load of covariates in there too. But these are the main test variables, if you like. So the sibling being a carer, once we started controlling for other factors, was only associated with the health outcome for siblings. Subjective poverty was associated with all of the outcomes, meaning those with more poverty had worse outcomes across the measures. And the level of independence of the person with intellectual and developmental disability showed that the siblings had worse mental health outcomes or mental distress, well-being and quality of life. Here we have the interaction terms, so the moderation terms, so how poverty affects the carer association with the sibling outcome. And we can see that this adds an additional association with mental distress, well-being, quality of life. And it was quite interesting actually because that extra association showed that siblings who were more middle class had worse outcomes when you started to take into account the carer factor. And I think the reason for that is those who experienced subjective poverty had worse outcomes overall, but it was almost like if you were already experiencing poverty and then you threw on top of that being a carer of someone with an intellectual and developmental disability, it didn't add to your mental distress. So it was almost like they'd hit the ceiling, whereas if you were financially well off, once you added in being a carer, that did increase your mental distress. That was quite an interesting interaction in my mind and was different to what I expected. And then if we look here, the carer and the level of independence, which we thought might work together in some way, wasn't statistically significant in any of the outcomes either. And here were the factors we controlled for. It's worth highlighting that none of these covariates down here were associated with any of these with all of these models. But we did have a few of the covariates that were associated with 3 of the 4 outcomes here. So, for example, siblings' age, siblings' education, whether the child with Down syndrome and the person with intellectual and developmental disability had Down syndrome. So these 2 were quite important. And then we had a few that were slightly less important. And what I found quite interesting about these covariates is I don't know whether a lot of you have heard who aren't in the IDD field about the Down syndrome advantage. Essentially, what we've noticed in a lot of IDD families is that if they have a child with Down syndrome, they tend to fare quite well compared to families of children with other intellectual or developmental disabilities. And we are seeing a bit of evidence of that here because it was associated with better mental distress, better well-being and better health in adult siblings. But what's interesting is autism's quite often seen as like this negative factor. So often what they'll do is they'll compare siblings of people with Down syndrome to siblings of people with autism to show that people with Down syndrome, they have better outcomes in their family than people with autism. And what we're seeing here is that autism isn't associated either with any of the outcomes. So although we're seeing some evidence here of a Down syndrome advantage, we're not seeing evidence of a negative narrative about the effect of someone having autism on their adult brother or sister. So I thought that was quite interesting as well. In the survey as well, we had a free text response at the end, and we still need to do some proper analysis on this data because we ended up getting like 80,000 words of responses. And I've got a slide here about mental health, but we also had quite a lot of comments on their relationships, which we'll cover in a bit. And as you can see here, people are talking about focusing so much on their brother or sister, their own mental health suffered, feeling guilt, hiding feelings, being scared of the future, pushing their own feelings down, feeling hopeless and alone. People are naming things like depression. And then in the last couple of ones, we see people talking about how identifying as a sibling was something that was helpful. And things like joining groups like SIBS and talking to other siblings has been something that these siblings also defined as useful as well. So I'm going to use the adult sibling survey data now to spend a bit of time talking about relationships. So in my mind, sibling relationships are really important, and this might be my own biases because I adore my siblings, including my brother who's autistic. Meltzer and Kramer make this point that siblings have the ability to influence one another's lives, and often it's said that siblings are the longest relationship that anyone will ever have. There's also this evidence too that siblings influence social behaviours in children, and that those social behaviours and those habits that are built up will then go on and influence relationships with other people as people grow up. We're also seeing a lot of data in the general sibling literature that suggests that sibling relationship quality is associated with mental health outcomes in both childhood and adulthood. And what we've seen as well in the disability literature is this argument that sibling relationships are even more important for the sibling that has an intellectual or developmental disability. If we think about the way that we live in a disabled society, and we think about the way that disabled people are often excluded in various social situations, siblings can provide a really important source of friendship from peers in a way that some disabled children aren't able to get in other contexts. So with sibling relationships in adults, again, using data from the adult sibling survey, we had a couple of master's students who worked on this data, Mollard and Lynn, and they used some data from the lifespan sibling relationship scale, which is an adult relationship sibling measure where adults are basically asked to sort of talk about their relationship now and then also report on their relationship as they remember it from being a child. And we only included the adult measures just to make sure that we weren't burdening our participants too much with a really long survey. And so there were three main scales that were able to be derived from this. The first was emotions toward the sibling and the relationship, and that one's called adult affect. There's belief about the sibling and the relationship, and that's adult cognitions, and then behavioural interactions with the sibling, so adult behaviour. And they've just fit a regression model. So what we can see here are all the covariates in the model that they included and whether they were statistically significantly associated with the three outcomes in their relationship, the adult affect, adult behaviour and adult cognitions. And it's worth just highlighting that this is just the view of the person who is the sibling. It's not the view of the person who has an intellectual or developmental disability. So what we can see here is that there were 4 outcomes and covariates that were statistically significant in all 3 domains of the relationship. So what we saw is that more health problems for the person with IDD was associated with more positive relationships, as was the sibling being a carer for them, and as was the sibling having another non-disabled sibling, and as was the person with IDD having a Down syndrome diagnosis. And these were all associated with more positive relationships across adult affect, behaviour and cognitions. And then there were a few covariates that were significant in some of the models, and that included levels of independence, sibling age, whether the sibling was older or younger than the person with IDD, and when the sibling lived with a person with IDD. So these results were quite common sense. For example, if the sibling lived with a person with IDD, wasn't associated with more sort of affection towards them. It wasn't associated with different thoughts towards them, but it was associated with different behaviours towards them, which makes a lot of sense because they're going to be interacting with each other more. And then on the adult sibling survey, lots used sort of that free text box to talk about their sibling relationships. And generally, we can see a lot of positive comments made about their relationships. And this was interesting because people would talk about how their mental health had been affected, but were still able to speak really positively about their brother or sister. So someone here writing how important their brother was for them, how fantastic. Someone here saying, I love my sister an insane amount. She's easily the most important person in my life, and we're very close. Talking about this person being my whole world. Here, my brother means the world to me. He shaped who I am now and how I carry myself and deal with life situations. I will spend my life protecting my brother and hope one day the world changes their opinions and attitudes. Here we have, I'm extremely close to my brother and have a firm bond with him, which has existed throughout our lives. Our relationship is strong and full of adoration on both sides, I think. My brother is my hero and I will continue to do everything I can to maintain his quality of life now and in the future. And I think what's a little bit interesting about these three bottom ones is there's a sense of questioning how reciprocal the relationship is. So here we've got thinking that the relationship is strong on both sides, I think. And here someone's talking about, it may seem to others like a one-sided relationship, but my sister is really kind and thoughtful and gives back to others in a less obvious way. And in the bottom one, I consider myself to have a very special relationship with my sister. I hope she thinks so too, but difficulties communicating her feelings makes being sure of this difficult. And something I've noticed from talking to a lot of adult siblings is exactly what's kind of captured in these bottom three. The relationship's important to them. They get this sense that it's reciprocal, but they understand that it doesn't seem that way to other people, or they sometimes question it themselves if their brother or sister with IDD doesn't themselves communicate verbally how they feel about the relationship, for instance. And so I suppose what this sort of highlights is that these relationships are different and they don't always seem as close to people on the outside as they feel to the people on the inside. And then the last bit of empirical data I want to talk about is a child sibling relationship study that we did. So this one was looking at sibling dyads where one had an intellectual disability and one sibling was typically developing, and it was looking at the associations between their behavioural adjustment and their sibling relationship quality. And this data came from the 1000 Family Study by Hastings et al. And that data study has over 1,000 like family members of people with an intellectual and developmental disabilities, and it's about to start its third wave of data collection, so it will be longitudinal. The sibling data was a bit limited. We had the strengths and difficulties questionnaire for both siblings, and we had the sibling relationship questionnaire. And overall, we were able to identify 500 sibling pairs where one of them had no ID, no Asperger's, no developmental disability, and then the other sibling had an intellectual disability. And this was our final measurement model. And what we can see here is that the siblings' prosocial behaviours was associated with their intimacy and companionship in their relationship. The siblings' externalising behaviours was associated with antagonism and quarrelling in the sibling relationship. In terms of the child with ID, their externalising, internalising and prosocial behaviours were associated with quarrelling and antagonism. And then their internalising behaviours and prosocial behaviours were associated with intimacy and companionship. And for all of these, more of the behaviour was associated with more of the relationship construct, with one, which makes sense, but the only exception is that for child prosocial behaviours, what we saw is more child prosocial behaviours were associated with more intimacy and companionship, exactly what you'd expect, but also the child with prosocial behaviours, their prosocial behaviours were also associated with more antagonism and quarrelling. And we think that might be due to the fact that children with ID that have high prosocial behaviours will also probably have better communication skills. They'll probably have a more mild form of intellectual disability. And this may mean that they're able to, yes, have more intimacy and companionship in their relationships, but they're also able to argue and quarrel and fight with their brother or sister in a more equal way. And the only covariate that was statistically significant was sibling birth order. And this was associated with basically if the sibling was younger than their brother or sister with intellectual disability, then they had more intimacy and companionship, as well as more antagonism and quarrelling. So it's probably related to the fact that they were spending more time together and therefore had both dimensions of the relationship. And what I find kind of interesting about this model overall is that it's not just a sibling with ID who's having this negative effect on the relationship. Both siblings are having positive and negative effects on both positive and negative parts of the relationship. And of course, when I say positive and negative, I say that with all the criticism in the world, because I'm really aware that, for example, a child shouting at their brother or sister for taking an item without asking for it is probably quite a helpful way to be able to talk about how you feel about things and change behaviour in the future. So we're using the terms positive and negative in slightly more complex ways. In terms of the statistical fit of this model, you can see here at the bottom, it was an adequate fit, so it wasn't a great fit. We're also working with cross-sectional data rather than longitudinal data. And so this model should just be seen as an interesting theoretical model with a bit of data to support it, because yeah, it's cross-sectional and that model fit is just about adequate. So that's all the empirical research I wanted to talk to you about, but I do have a couple of slides where I'm just going to lead us in a discussion about the implication of all of this on theory, research and practice. So in terms of theory, these data support a systems approach being used to inform analyses, particularly the reciprocal effects. In terms of future research, there is a sense here of resisting a negative narrative, and obviously with this focus on the relationship studies, something that needs to happen in future research is there needs to be this focus on finding ways to include the perspectives of both siblings, because obviously we can't really know much about a relationship if we're only really asking one person in the relationship about it. And this is really quite difficult when you're thinking about people who have intellectual disability that's more severe or profound. It might be very difficult to get their views on their relationship. And obviously they'll have to think about more creative ways if you've got someone who's non-verbal, for instance. So I have collected some data using talking mats to be able to get the perspectives on both children with a severe intellectual disability and their brothers and sisters without an intellectual disability, to get their feelings and views on their relationship. I still need to analyse that data, but it seems to have worked for some of the children with ID, and so I'll be able to explore a bit about how that worked methodologically as well. But I think it's something that's really, really important, and we have seen that with siblings of children and adults with more mild intellectual disability, and we've seen it with siblings of people who are autistic, but we've not seen it so much with people with more moderate to severe levels of intellectual disability. So I think that's really important that we work together as a research field to think about how methodologically we can achieve that. There's obviously a need for longitudinal analyses, and the 1,000 Families should provide some of that, but hopefully there'll be other longitudinal analyses coming out too. We also want to think about indirect and bidirectional effects. So some of these models and theories we were talking about at the beginning would help us think about how we might model things, how we might think about moderating effects and mediating effects. And those are really important for us to take this research to the next level, is to not just think about direct effects, but start to question some of these more complicated questions. And we also really need to be focusing on underrepresented siblings. So you'll see in my studies, the convenience-based ones, the samples were predominantly white, predominantly middle class, predominantly female, lots of mums reporting. Sisters are more likely to report than brothers, for example. And a lot of the data is from Western samples, rather than samples from the East or from the Global South. There are some data, but we need more as well. So that's a real need in our research area, is to, I guess, to not just do studies that focus on specific groups, but also to be better as, and this isn't just a sibling family IDD problem, it is a social sciences problem. We need to get a lot better at being able to recruit really diverse samples, and also we probably need to get better at doing statistical analyses, like applying weightings to our analyses to be able to make our sample analyses more representative, like they do on like larger population studies. But I suspect that's very complicated, but I think that's something that we need to get better at. And in terms of clinical and practice-based implications, our data didn't support a pathologized and deterministic approach to supports. What we found is that not all siblings are having clinically worse outcomes on these measures. In fact, most of them are doing fine. And so if we're thinking about how we're going to talk about siblings and how we're going to offer support, we shouldn't be offering it blanketly. We should be thinking about which siblings actually need it. What was good about the kind of work I did on my PhD was it had this collaboration with SIBS, and that meant that it always had some real world applicability. So I was able to get feedback from adult siblings and from the organisation very easily. And it also meant that even when we're waiting for like a year and a half to get something published, SIBS were able to use that data as soon as we'd written the paper. And so it was really good to have that relationship because it informed, for example, some of their work they did with focusing on some siblings who were experiencing some socioeconomic deprivation. So I think having that grassroots link and getting to work with a charity as good as SIBS was really, really helpful for that. And I think it can be very helpful for SIBS as well, because then they can think about, we've got finite resources, we can't do everything, we're a small charity. So it allows them to think about who they can focus on supporting and which groups might need it the most. With the embedded systems framework from Kovchev et al. That we showed earlier, the data that I've got here supports a lot of that model and helps us to consider which sites to focus support on. So for example, that model might help us to think about, if we're going to do an intervention, why not focus on the whole family, not just the sibling dyad, for example. And it also might encourage us to think about school-based approaches, which is what SIBS has done in their SIBS Talk intervention. It also might help us inform interventions about how to foster sibling relationships. So that covariate about sibling birth order being significant in that last model I showed you, that might tell us, for example, that we need to support older siblings to have closer relationships with their brothers and sisters with IDD. But it might also talk to us about having teaching younger siblings how to deal with conflict better, for example. And then the last point is probably a bit of a miserable point to end on, and that is just that what kept coming out, especially from the psychological outcomes papers, was that there's some real structural, political, financial problems and these campaign aspects around addressing inequality, about addressing poverty, and about addressing the disableism towards people who have intellectual and developmental disabilities. And it feels like these are really urgent questions, and that sometimes when you're doing just sibling research or just family research, sometimes it feels like you don't get a chance to address these much bigger problems. But what was quite clear to me is that these inequalities are driving a lot of the negative outcomes that we're seeing for siblings and for disabled people and for family members. And so it's a really important area, and we have to think about, I guess, not just thinking clinically, but also perhaps thinking politically about what we do next in terms of supporting siblings and families and disabled people. And that was everything that I wanted to share with you today. So I did want to just quickly thank the ESRC and SIBS for funding this research, my supervisor, Richard Hastings, and all of the co-authors that worked on the project. And then obviously I'd really like to thank all of the participants who took part in the research and all the families who engaged with participant engagement activities throughout the research as well. And yeah, thank you very much for everyone for turning up and listening. And it would be great if you guys can ask some questions or make some comments. And thank you.
Thank you, Nikita. Thank you so much for this. I have also enabled the chat function now. We're ready to take some questions. I think, Nikki, you're first.
Hiya, yeah, excuse my background, actually I'm going to take my camera off. I found this a really pertinent point, and that this is why I joined into it, because it's something I don't know anything about research, I'm a nurse, but I think actually it needs to have a lot more in it, because certainly when I was working in London, we had this Asian woman. A lot of them were of a different race to myself, and she basically said, I promised my parents on our deathbed that I will look after my brother, and an older generation, and she just felt so devastated she couldn't actually keep that commitment to her parents, and the guilt there was, and this is my adult sibling, and actually it's my responsibility, and I've made these promises, and all that caught up with the guilt. So when you go and see people, when you go and do an assessment on somebody, I very much use my eyes and my ears to see what else is going on, because you don't know what's going on. I mean, I think COVID's actually had a huge problem because of all these video calls. You can't see what's going on. you can't see the family dynamics, and it's so important. So I just thank you, but yeah, thank you.
Yeah, the cultural aspects are really, really interesting, and we don't know very much about them because we've been so bad at recruiting diverse samples. But we know that family values are really, really different in different cultures, and this idea of a mum and dad and 2 children is an incredibly recent Western construct. And for example, in Japan, you have like legal obligations to care for siblings and parents when they need full-time care, and that's just not something that happens in other countries. And it will be interesting to think about whether there are other cultures where there's something really similar that happens, but it's just not legally enshrined, for example.
Yeah.
Certainly, thank you. Helen has put a comment in the chat function. I don't know if you can see it, Nikita. She's saying that it would be interested to see about data about siblings that have had diagnosis missed because of their sibling presenting more typically.
I think that is an interesting area, and I think there are 2 kind of areas there that are interesting. The one is that I need to do some research on siblings where they both have an intellectual and developmental disability, because it's really common to have, you know, one sibling that has intellectual disability and autism, and then the other sibling has autism without an intellectual disability, and it's picked up later. Especially if they're a girl, it's picked up in adulthood often. And I've heard it a lot actually, where people sort of come to me like taking part in research and say, I'm not sure I'm a sibling because I've been diagnosed recently with autism. And that happens a lot. So I do think there's enough there to do an interesting analysis, and because I think those people are interested in taking part in research, but they don't necessarily think they're a sibling anymore because they now also have a diagnosis. And ADHD is an interesting one because it's, you know, I have dyspraxia, for instance, and so that's considered a neurodiversity. But some neurodiversities are seen as a lot more associated with autism than others. So dyspraxia is one of them, ADHD is another one, but then dyslexia is less seen as associated. So it's that question about at what point are you neurodiverse, and this question about how much are we all to some extent neurodiverse comes it's not black and white at all, is it? It's very grey.
Yeah, certainly. Any other questions?
There's one from Nigel here about overlap between the findings about young carers who may be caring for a parent or sibling. So yeah, there's not actually that much research about carers. There was like young carers, there was like a little burst of money about 10 years ago, and then it kind of dried up with austerity measures. And so there's some qualitative studies, and there's 1 or 2 surveys in there in the UK, but there's not as much research compared to siblings. A lot of it is like reports rather than peer-reviewed papers. Some of those reports, there's one by like Cheeseborough, that's a Department for Education report, and they reckon that 50% of young carers are caring for a sibling. However, what's not clear is whether they're caring for a sibling because their parent isn't able to look after a younger sibling, or whether they're caring for a sibling because that sibling has an intellectual developmental disability. So we haven't got clear data on what that means. But what I would say is that SIBS do a lot of work, for example, with young carers, charities and organisations, because that overlap is seen. And you'll notice that a lot of young carers organisations have sibling reports because there is an overlap between those groups. But it was interesting. I did some young carer work a few years ago, but it like the funding's dried up. It's not there anymore in the way it once was.
Claire, you have a question?
It was actually a comment, really, around what you were just saying about your identity, whether you're a young carer or a sibling carer. And I think that as budgets get squeezed, you get squeezed out of that young carer role. And yes, I work in social care, and I've also got a disabled child. So I've got 3 children who are siblings of a child with a disability. And it's really quite interesting about how children who are siblings are visible, and whether they're seen by a local authority as somebody who is a sibling of a child, or whether they're a young carer of a child. Now, my family situation, my son has a very complex epilepsy, so my children were definitely young carers, despite my wish that they wouldn't be, because if you dropped in front of them in a massive fit, it was all hands on deck. But but I think there's a question about how we recognise these children and how that's related to budgets, social care, and the wish to avoid giving children services if they don't have to. So, for example, where I work and where I live, you are only a sibling, you are only a young carer if there's no adult on the scene doing full-time care, which I find really fascinating.
I think it's the legislation changed recently so that young carers are now allowed to apply for some money to support their role, and so that might be why their local authorities are really restricting the definition of what a young carer is.
It is fascinating.
Money.
One of the things you were saying earlier on was that children identifying as siblings and getting results from organisations with other siblings are really important. So their identity and how they see themselves and how they're viewed is hugely important, isn't it?
Yeah, I don't know how many of you are on social media, but it's interesting to see how many people identify as a sibling. And I think that makes a lot of sense when you're like a primary carer for someone. But I've also heard autistic people, for example, say, how dare someone define themselves by my diagnosis? And that can also be a bit strange. So yeah, there are lots of questions about the identity stuff. Someone here is asking about population studies about end-of-life care or person that's passed away. That's another thing I've spoken to Claire about in SIBS, and the bereavement kind of questions and siblings who lose their brother or sister with IDD is a really important one, and something that I think there needs to be some research on, but there's definitely not any population level data about that. The population level data is very limited. There's like, if you include broader disability, I think that I would say there was 6 in total. So, and they're not about end of life care at all. And it's a really important thing because obviously, think about people with Down syndrome, their life expectancy is only in the 60s at the moment. And so siblings are probably going to outlive them, and they're going to have to experience that. And like you said earlier about identity in siblings, well, are you still a sibling if your brother or sister has passed away? And are you still allowed to access services and call yourself a sibling and sit there in a sibling group? And these are the kinds of questions that siblings ask. I think someone's got their hand up.
Yes.
Really.
Simon.
Hello. Yes. Sorry. No, it's just really interesting to listen to your presentations because I'm 45. My brother is autistic with a moderate learning disability. He's 49, and I sort of went through this back in the good old days of the 80s. And I'm now a behavioural practitioner. I've worked professionally in it now for 30 years, and I find it interesting as I've got older to reflect back on my childhood, which is I spotted this talk and thought I'm going to listen to this out of interest, but using potentially people say my age to feedback to help people who are going through it now, because I look back on it now and this is not a complaint, this is just a fact of life. I don't think I ever switch off. I don't think I've ever switched off, and I think that is something that came from being a younger carer. I was always, what's he going to do next? What's he doing now? And being always on, as the lady commented, it's all hands on deck sometimes. And I think that some of us of our age and now who've been through this, if we can, I don't know, help provide evidence to someone such as yourself that it's okay to feel under pressure as a child. It's okay to feel this way. Maybe I'm not being very articulate what I'm saying, but if we can provide information to someone such as yourself and to young people who are going through this now, that they are not alone, it's not untypical what they're experiencing, I think that would be very beneficial. Because I'll be honest, about SIBS, I'd love to have had SIBS in 1985, but that was just my comment, really.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and that quote just comes out from like multiple different studies that siblings say is that I didn't realise I didn't have to be alone, or I'm not alone. And when we did the SIBS talk intervention evaluation, the kids, that's like one of the things that came out so much from the kids, the sense of realising that there are lots of kids like them that have a brother or sister with ID. And I can see someone in this chat sort of saying, it's reassuring to hear that, conflict's common in younger siblings. Conflict's common in every relationship, full stop, especially siblings, whether you have a disability or not. Like, is there anyone that you care about that you haven't had a bit of conflict with once? No. It's, ubiquitous conflict in relationships. It's completely natural. And siblings like to hear and need to hear that other people have similar experiences. But also, Siblings also probably need to learn that they're allowed to say no to certain things, and certain things aren't acceptable. So yeah, other kids probably do get hit by their brother or sister with IDD, but that doesn't mean it's okay to get hit by your brother or sister with IDD. So there's always got to be, I guess, limits to normalizing some things.
Yeah. Millie, you have your hand up for a question?
Yes, not really a question, a comment. I'm actually joining you guys from the United States. I happen to get an email on a conference that I was interested in. I'm like, okay, well, let me see what this is about. I'm a mother of twins, 7-year-old twins, boy and girl. My son is on the spectrum. And although they have a ways to go to become an adult, this is always something that I think about often, like, you know, what's going to happen to my son. I mean, you always assume that he's going to have a sister, but you certainly don't want to just give that responsibility to someone, you know, that you just try and make plans and set them up as best you can. Currently, I'm not with the father, so that's another aspect of that. Just thinking, okay, well, what happens? And I just finished with my master's in developmental disabilities, and I'm in the behavior analysis field. So I
Have we lost Millie? Hello, Millie? Are you still there? No, I think we've lost that. So, yes.
Millie, you went quiet.
Oh, was I muted for a while?
Oh, there she is. Okay.
Sorry, you were talking
I didn't
about.
realize I was muted. I don't even know how much of that you got, but I'm joining you guys from the United States, and I have a son on the spectrum. And this was very, very interesting to me because up until recently, I really didn't think of how much time you spend just finding the services for your child with special needs, and you realize, well, you know, this child is getting all the attention because, you know, they need speech, they need this therapy, they need to go to a special school, they're not, you know, they're not with their sibling. And I realize how important it is to realize that the neurotypical child also needs some attention, and they have struggles understanding, you know, why their child is different. Well, why we can't just pick up and go to just any event. You have to plan it out. Okay, well, is this something that your brother's going to tolerate, you know, and stuff like that, and just making time for your child and that doesn't have special needs. And obviously always thinking ahead in the future, like, you know, is this child gonna grow up to be an independent adult? Is the sibling gonna have to care, you know, for the child? And it's just so overwhelming. And it's kind of nice that you know, I have conferences such as this one, and to kind of help you think of, you know, the siblings, because everything, you know, everything at least that I read is to do with autism, because my son is on the spectrum. But it's also important to make sure that the siblings' well-being and mental health and all that is being taken care of. So thank you so much. It was very informative, and I'm really glad I got this email notification on joining this chat. So thank you.
Thanks, Millie. A lot of parents, I think, worry a lot about siblings. So it's nice to know that most siblings are doing well. And lots of adult siblings want to have conversations with their parents about what's going to happen in the future. So, yeah, I think SIBS get a load of calls from parents, so you're not alone in thinking about both of them.
Yes, thank you. I think thank you for such an interesting talk, Nikita, and for, you know, providing us all that food for thought, really. There's I'm going to make all the comments available. You can see them. I think you'll have access to the comments, so you can, you know, respond if you like afterwards. And thank you all so much for joining us. I know this is the last seminar before the festive period, so have a lovely holiday, everyone. I hope you get well-deserved rest and be with family, even though COVID numbers don't look very good, but try your best to relax. We all need it. So thank you ever so much, and see you in the new year. Wait for that email to come out soon about the next seminar. Thank you. Bye, everyone. Thank you, Nikita. Bye.